the number one reason people hate sprinters is because of the emissions issues that they experience. I will put this disclaimer out there for everyone. All right. If it's your first sprinter, stay away from 2010 to 2013. Oh man, don't even get me started about the way people advertise their vans. Yeah.
Totally.
Sprinter is done.
Why it is that I chose the Ford Transit over the Mercedes Sprinter.
There's just no reason for you to buy or invest into a Mercedes Sprinter cargo van because
why I would never buy a Sprinter.
So are these Sprinter vans even worth buying? The following is a discussion I had with an aspiring Sprinter owner.
And I put together a list of something like 20 questions. Why opt for a Sprinter over something else that has similar height in the back, like a ProMaster or a Transit? I mean, those are like the big three that people are always comparing. What are the most reliable years in terms of the model, the vehicle, the generations? I've seen like a lot of stuff. There's a little confusion. So I'm curious if you could lay that out for the interested purchaser. What's the relevance of emissions for someone who's looking to purchase?
I mean, do we really need another video about some self-proclaimed expert droning on about his knowledge on Sprinter vans? How long is this video anyway? Oh, wow. I can already hear the comments saying, "Are you serious? Too long. Didn't watch. It's a stupid van. How could I possibly talk for 90 minutes on this one topic?" It's not that deep. It's just a van. Don't overthink it. Go out and purchase one. Now, this might seem like common sense advice, but it's the furthest thing from it. Again, this video is a discussion where I talk someone through buying a van and answer every question along the way. Most importantly, I discuss all the confusion around Sprinters and the reasons people hate them and the reasons people love them. And I help people like you figure out whether or not you should even own one of these. So here's how you avoid a whole lot of regret purchasing your next van.
And I put together a list of something like 20 questions. So the first question was like from a basic overview perspective, like why opt for a Sprinter over something else that has similar height in the back, like a ProMaster or a Transit? I mean, those are like the big three that people are always comparing.
Let's present the facts, right?
Sure.
Sprinters, it drives the best. It drives way better than a Transit. You know, if you ask anyone, drive one and then drive the other, they're going to say, "Oh yeah, the Sprinter van drives better." It's also a little bit thinner, which, kind of made for the European roads, right? Where things are a little thinner. That really does improve driving ability. It's not that great on the building the interior side, right? Because you have that egg shape. But from a driving experience side, has the best driving experience, has the most internal room, and is the most efficient in terms of miles per gallon for the engine.
What about serviceability?
Yeah, so that's an interesting one that most people don't realize. So they'll think Mercedes, it's expensive to service. Ford, it's affordable to service. What people really need to be thinking is modern diesel, that's expensive to service. Gas-powered engines, generally more affordable to service. And when it comes to whether it's a diesel Transit or a diesel Mercedes Sprinter, they have the same part. The manufacturers do the same parts. They're the same manufacturers. You're ordering from the same company, etc. You have the Bosch fuel delivery system, which is the most complex and most expensive. The turbochargers are made by the same manufacturer. That's one thing that's what you need to realize, right? So generally the way I put it, if you're not like reasonably handy, so to speak, and not really interested in doing your own service later on, just get a gas-powered Transit and call it a day. You're going to be a lot happier. You're going to have a lot fewer headaches. The amount you save in fuel is going to be trivial compared to what you could be paying year after year for servicing and for repairs. Yeah.
Do you think that there's enough like online resources for like common fixes that people might face with a Sprinter. That if they're handy, that that information and resources are available for DIY and hands-on mechanical work.
Yeah, so it's gone a lot better, of course, over at least the last 5 years, if not the last 10. There's definitely some gaps which channels like mine are trying to fill. Short answer is yes. If you're reasonably handy and you're willing to spend a couple $100 or $50 to $300 on a tool that gives you the appropriate feedback to do the right repairs, then yeah, absolutely. Most people who are willing to really get their hands dirty and consider this a long-term commitment, yeah, you'll be able to fix your own van. I think the trouble I'm seeing is a lot of people don't necessarily feel confident doing certain repairs. If they just did it once, they'd feel a lot more confident in doing it again, I think. Or
yeah, that makes sense. Is that an OBD scanner that you're referring to?
Yep, just something that plugs into the OBD2 port. I have a video talking all about scanners. It's a little outdated. There's no product placements whatsoever in that video. I don't have any paid links. I do have a scanner with a paid link on my Amazon store right now, there's a lot of people raving about it. I have yet to do a full in-depth video on it, but I think that's going to be an answer to a lot of people who are willing to spend, I think it was in the low 300s, depending on the Amazon sale, and it does almost everything. So that's a really good DIY tool.
Right. It's probably also worth getting a scanner even during the purchase process, because you want to be able to scan the vehicle that you're looking at buying. Is that right?
It will pay for itself 10 times over, more than likely, to do that. And it comes down to a lot of things, right? One, if you're in a state that has things like smog and stuff, you can check the drive cycles and make sure that it'll pass everything before you buy it, right? If that line of check marks says it's okay, you should be able to roll into the smog thing or whatever inspection your state has, and they'll sign everything off and call it a day. You won't have that anxiety and uncertainty. Two, is you'll be able to see if they just erased the codes, right? So, if you're considering buying this vehicle from someone and you scan it and you see where codes were erased 5 miles ago, and you ask them, are there any trouble codes? Are there anything I need to be aware of? Be like, I don't know. No, they say, no, there's nothing wrong with it. Well, then, if you can't really trust them to tell you that, at the end of the day, you want to buy a vehicle from someone who's reasonably trustworthy. And that would be a huge red flag for me, even if it's running perfectly. I'd be extra cautious about moving forward with that.
Totally. Okay. OBD scanner check. Talking about let's assume that you made a good case for Sprinter, and I think you do, both now and in general. What are the most reliable years in terms of the model of the vehicle, the generations? I've seen a lot of stuff. There's a little confusion, so I'm curious if you could lay that out for the interested purchaser.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of confusion, a whole lot of confusion, and I'll get to that in a second. But I want to lay everything out first, starting from 2002 up until 2023 plus, which was the most recent update. All right, 2002, the Sprinter comes to the US for the first time. It has a 2.7 liter engine. That's an inline 5. Let's see, OM612 is the engine code. Doesn't really matter. It's an inline 5, right? There's that engine at that point was a little bit dated and was due for a refresh. So in 2004, they had another engine that's an inline 5, the exact same size, but it's updated. The ECU is updated. The head is updated. It has it has 2 fuel pumps, right? One's lift pump to get the fuel out of the tank, and then you have a high pressure pump. Before that, the fuel was just kind of getting pulled directly from the tank, and that would lead to a few issues for hard starts. And, if you're extra handy, you can kind of do upgrades to make your 2002 or 2003 work more like a 04 to 06. But most people on their first Sprinter purchase, I generally don't recommend it, right? So the Sprinters with what I call sort of the overhyped Sprinters, the 2004 to 2006 inline five still. People like them because you don't need a lot of feedback to work on them, right? Generally, the average individual who knows how to turn a wrench will be pretty happy working on their sprinters of those years, right? Emissions for that time, the pre-2007 in general, practically non-existent. You have a little EGR valve and a little, in general, nobody really has issues with the emissions during those model years. The emissions were extremely simple. All right. 2007 comes along. Europe is becoming more stringent on their emission standards. The US is becoming more stringent. They roll out the first generation of kind of more strict emission standards. I'm going to be mentioning a few things, but in terms of emissions, you can kind of think of it as three different phases, right? Pre-2007, which is practically nothing, negligible emissions. 2007 to 2009, you have 3 model years, which I'll say they're kind of minimal emissions, right? 2010 plus, they're essentially, they have all three systems, emission systems working. They have all 3 systems installed. And since then, emissions haven't really changed. There's been a few updates, nitty gritty stuff, which we can get into. But for the most part, 2010 plus, you're looking at the most emissions that you see on any vehicles, right? And that's really more federal standards. So pretty much around that time, the same thing occurs with any diesel engine, whether it's a Ford Transit. If they had them back then, I think they really rolled them out. The diesels, they rolled them out a few years later, but Ford had diesels, right? 2011, same thing, the same thing for them, right? They had all the emissions working. Now, what pretty much everyone gets wrong, and I've had arguments with people about this, and there's people making YouTube videos about sprinters, and they'll tell you, oh yeah, anything after 2007 has terrible emissions. They have all the DEF fluid and all that, and the NOx sensors and all that. There's half a dozen videos where, you know, very established people on YouTube will talk about that, and I'm like, that's not true. You know, that's, if I call the dealership up and give them my VIN number for my 2008 Sprinter and say, hey, I want NOx sensors, I want a DEF system fluid part, and they're going to tell me, you're crazy, your van doesn't come with that, right? So from the factory, 2007 to 2009, no diesel exhaust fluid, all right? I'm getting a little bit in the weeds here.
I'd be curious if you could sort of spell out what's the relevance of emissions for someone who's looking to purchase.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So pretty much every single, I'm gonna get in a little bit of heat for this, but I'm just gonna say it. Every single really extreme issue that occurs with modern diesels is generally emissions related, right? So the number one, and I will say, and I'll go on record saying this, the number one reason people hate sprinters is because of the emissions issues that they experience. Yeah.
So keeping that in mind, then what years are the best to be looking at, given that strong statement?
Yeah, absolutely. In my humble experience, I think if you're a first-time buyer, you want to get the 2007 to 2009 Sprinter vans. There's a few reasons for that. One is that they're generally very, very affordable. They don't have the cult-like following of the 2004s to 2006, which are okay. They don't really, the T1N, right? The ones that everyone raves about, the ones that say, oh yeah, get the older ones, they're amazing. I kind of get it. They're fun little vehicles. They're pretty, they're not fun on long trips. All right. And I've only owned one of those older ones, but in general, down to the manufacturing issue of it just being an inline 5 engine, you have these weird vibrations that even if it's working perfectly straight from the factory, inline 5 engines aren't perfectly balanced. All right. So just from the start, yeah, and again, I'm talking about 5 cylinders in a straight line, just to be really clear about what an inline 5 engine is. All right. They're not perfectly balanced, right? So you kind of have like a rough driving experience. Most people who drive for long hours say it's kind of a chore driving them, even if you upgrade the most comfortable seat and everything. You kind of have that older diesel feel, which is fine for some people. I get it. I get it. If you somehow manage to find an amazing deal on one of those, that's fine. But for the most part, since there's that big following, they're generally overpriced, generally tough to find now. Might have been a different thing 5 years ago, but it's really tough to find something with low miles, with reasonable maintenance, that's in good condition now. So it puts the restoration process at an entirely new level for someone who's just looking to get into it. Yeah.
Totally. Tell me a little about what's referred to as the D1 refresh from 2014 to 2018. You
Sure.
mentioned that in your estimation, there's not much difference between 2007 and 2018. So I'm curious what's going on there.
Yeah. So let's put this into perspective just from the engine standpoint. All right. The engine from 2007 all the way up to 2022, that's the 3.0 sort of V6 engine. That's been pretty much the same engine for those, I don't know how many years that is, 16, 17 model years. I don't know. That's kind of a big deal, right? They've used that engine for a very, very long time. Now, within that time, you have a lot happening, right? You have the 2000, let's talk about 2010 first, and I'll reference around 2014. 2010 rolls along. You have a slightly updated engine. The wiring harness is different. The ECU is different. The emissions, of course, are very different.
Different better or different worse on the emissions?
Different worse. Unfortunately, they're more strict, right? There's a higher burden of emissions due to federal regulations. So they're approaching that burden with more stuff on the exhaust system. Now, 2010 to 2013, most people will see 2007 to 2013 from the exterior, and I'll show some photos just so that people have a view. You can't tell the difference from the outside, right? The exterior is near identical. All right. 2014 rolls along. You have the refresh, right? Interior, nothing's different, right? It really just depends on your options, no meaningful changes. Most people won't be able to tell the difference from the inside. On the outside, you have, and again, I'll show some pictures, but you have the real nice looking headlights, the grill's bigger, in my humble opinion, and I realize it's a little dated now, but that's probably one of the best looking front ends of the vehicle that Mercedes has made for the Sprinter. Now, yeah, the 2019 refresh, they did the whole interior and exterior. That has its own good look. They're still holding on to it to this day, right? So they've had it for about 6+ years now. I will say this, the primary vehicle I suggest, 2007 to 2009, I will admit it has the ugliest exterior front end. So that's kind of the one thing that makes it not the perfect Sprinter. Now, for people who don't really care too much about how their vehicle looks, they're probably not going to care, right? If you do care, if you're willing to spend maybe $1,000 to $2,000 or so, you can take the front end off of a 2014 to 18, slap it on your 2007 plus Sprinter, and it'll look like a 2018 Sprinter from the outside. Not tough to do. It's been done quite a few times. People are catching on now, so it's a little tougher to find those parts. But if you know of a salvage yard near you that, if a Sprinter gets in an accident, just go ask for the front end. You need the hood, you need the side panels, and you need the lights and grill and the bumper and all that. In my humble opinion, that would be the best of both worlds, right? So
give it a little facelift.
Exactly, a facelift. Yeah.
I know that the more recent years, like past, 2020, 22, 23, may not be relevant for people that are looking in the secondhand market, but I'm curious if there was anything you wanted to add about the most recent years.
Yeah, I mean, the four-wheel drive went away in 2022. They replaced it with an all-wheel drive. For most people, that's not a meaningful difference. The fact that there is an all-wheel drive, that's going to satisfy 95% plus of use cases. The thing is, the all-wheel drive on the Mercedes, they're at like the third or fourth generation of it. So it's actually kind of good now. What the first all-wheel drives back in 2007 on the SUVs, they might have been different or before that. So they've definitely refined that. Yeah, what else to say? 2.0, everything, pretty much everything from 2023 onward in the US is the smaller inline four 2-liter engine, very similar to the older 2.1 liter inline four engines that were an option before as well. Not really anything wrong with them. I got a chance to really take a real close look at a 2024 a month or two ago, and they've done some things that I think will make the emissions more reliable, and there's some good things happening. So I wouldn't be afraid of getting that smaller engine.
Totally. And the emissions issue that you mentioned, they're 2010 onwards, as in they're bad kind of going forward from your perspective.
No, I wouldn't say bad. So I will put this disclaimer out there for everyone. All right. If it's your first Sprinter, stay away from 2010 to 2013. So that was like the first generation of that AdBlue SCR system. Now, you're not really going to see in any manuals like, oh yes, this is Gen 1 SCR AdBlue, whatever. But you will see it in a very expensive scan tool, say Gen 1 SCR and whatnot. It was so bad that there was a class action recall of it. Kind of closed up. The window to get it closed up a couple years ago, but that was a huge mess in itself because the recall was so broad that dealerships, maybe they did want to do it, maybe they weren't really getting the appropriate coverage for the repairs that were technically included in the recall. There were dealerships that were doing things that were explicitly stated in the recall not to do. Like there was at least 3 line items in the recall, and I can put it up if you find this interesting. I'll get to it later and add it in the edit. It said it in at least 2 or 3 different areas within the recall. You cannot charge for diagnostic fees related to the recall. It was very, very expressly stated in at least 2 places. And you still got people saying, no, you're going to have to pay at least a $300 diagnostic fee, and then you get this 20 or 30 grand of free repairs. There were all kinds of issues happening there. I sent my customers there and I was like, hey, you could pay me to do all this work, or you could have the dealership do it for free. New ECUs, new exhaust systems. Sometimes it happened. Sometimes things worked out really well. Other times, a complete show. Like, maybe the customer got frustrated with the dealership and then they said they've been driving around without an exhaust in the back, and that exhaust or the lack of exhaust meant fumes melted the wiring harness, and they just got all these other crazy issues happening now. So really, I don't know, tough to execute that on a national scale, but yeah, at least avoid the 2010 to 2013 years, unless if it's your second Sprinter and you kind of know them, you're used to fixing them and you see a good deal, go for it. But 2014 plus, they are generally at least a little more reliable, tiny bit simpler as well, but yeah.
That's super helpful. I noticed that there's just like so much bad information about sprinters online, which is why I reached out to you, and I got to see some of your prior work where your like immense knowledge on the subject is really just immediately evident. And with some other people that are doing reviews and tutorials, like it's pretty apparent that they don't know what they're talking about. Some worse than others. But I'm like, dude, you should know, like these other people should not be making videos. This is not just like not helpful. It's actually misinformation. And I think this is going to be, if and when this gets shared, will be a really, really like thorough resource for anyone who's looking to purchase. So again, just thank you for that. So if I'm understanding, the practical takeaway is that from like a balance of reliability, updates and features, emissions issues, you recommend somewhere between 2007, 2009. The engine doesn't change all that much going forward. And if one really wants to get the pretty um, the weather bumper meets the headlight, they can go and find a face to replace it. But that's my practical takeaway from that section. Anything you want to correct in that before I move forward?
No, yeah, that's great. If
Awesome.
2014 plus to 2018, that's okay too. That would probably be the second best. But yeah, definitely avoid that 10 to 13. In my experience, there's pretty much everyone who buys one of those has a headache with or without the recall. Even if they've done the recall, maybe they did a portion of the recall and there's weird sensors that are just kind of sitting right outside their accepted value range where it's just throwing codes and stuff. Just the really weird issues that make me scratch my head is generally in those model years, unfortunately. Yeah.
Yeah, best to avoid that for. Sweet. I want to do it. The next sort of bunch of questions are kind of the numbers that are thrown around with specific models. And I think this is really problematic in so many fields of purchasing. Like if you're going to buy a new computer, you have to like figure out what does the RAM mean? What does the gig mean? What does this mean? What does that mean? So there are lots of numbers that are thrown around with sprinters. And I was hoping to kind of go through some of the numbers and the options there to make sense for a first time buyer of what those numbers mean. So maybe the first one is the sprinters will be either listed as 2,500 or 3,500, and that's like a different class of vehicle. I hope you might be able to explain the difference there.
Yeah, sure. So they kind of took that naming convention from Dodge Ram, I think, when it was sort of its own, when when Daimler was merged with Dodge back in the mid 2000s. So, and that sort of stuck with it. So in the US, in the UK, in Europe in general, you won't see that naming convention of 2,500 and 3,500, right? Over here, all that means is the 3,500, it has a bigger gross vehicle weight. If you're hauling stuff, you can load more up in the back. The leaf springs, the things that support the rear tires, are generally beefier. And there's 4 tires in the back. So they're all 3,500s, almost all 3,500s in the US are dualies, with one exception, which I'll get to. All right. So you have 4 tires in the back. For van conversions, there's very few reasons you should go for 3,500s. Unless maybe if you know you're towing heavy consistently, because they will have a better tow rating. Now, the real differences in the 3,500s, I mentioned the leaf springs, things that support the rear tires, the tires themselves, right? You're going to see 4 of them, and you're going to see a slightly upgraded braking system. Contrary to popular belief, the transmissions aren't any beefier to handle the higher towing capacity. Braking system is a little bit better. Slightly more reinforced transmission mount, which doesn't really have any practical meaning. So you'll see these tiny differences, but for the most part, if you see a good deal, get a good deal. Don't be like, oh, I need a 3,500 or I need a 2,500. Might be few exceptions. If you're in California, there might be more slightly higher road taxes for the 35s. I'm not 100% sure, but certain states classify light duty and medium duty in different ways. I think in California, pretty much all sprinters are medium duty. The GVR, gross vehicle weight, I think even on the biggest, baddest 3,500 is just below that 10,000 pound mark, where you need a there's other sort of, it delves into the commercial space after that. So I think they're at like 99.90 or something, very close to 10,000. And can you load it down with 12,000? Of course you can, but just from a sticker perspective, that's their quote limit, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
So practically speaking, most people who are doing conversion, unless they are going to be towing heavy loads, are better off and will be well served by 2,500.
Yeah, just get the 2,500. I mean, yeah.
Okay, next set of mysterious numbers to demystify, and you're doing a wonderful job at this, so thank you, is the engine. So engines can either be listed as OM 651 2.1 liter or OM 642 3 liter.
Yeah, so you're really only going to see the 2.1s mostly around California. Like you see very few of those in Texas and other states. There seems to be a lot more of them in California now. OM651 is the inline four. I think it was only available 14, 15, and 16, if I'm not mistaken. But they've had various versions of an inline four, I think 2019 and beyond. And I think now everything's a 2-liter for the most part. They have variations of the 2-liter, which I don't necessarily want to get into. Ultimately, if you're a first-time buyer, I will say this. Generally, for most people, I'd say just get the 3-liter. You're probably going to find a better deal on it. The propensity for used parts is generally a lot easier just because, 95% of sprinters are still 3-liter, right? And with that said, you have that 3-liter not only on sprinter vans, but you have it in SUVs. You have it in 2 SUVs. You have it in the one weird R-Class hatchback that Mercedes made. You also have it in a couple sedans. So there's a lot more options if you do ever need to get a used engine in the future. Yeah, there might be some minor differences, but most competent mechanics can figure those out. But with that said, if you find a really great deal on a 2.1 liter and it's low mileage, go for it. I will say the fact that the engine's smaller doesn't necessarily mean. The fact that the engine's smaller means it generally requires more boost, a little more pressure, a little more blow by. You might not have that 600,000, 800,000 mile engine on your hands. But for 90+% of people, I think they'd be really happy if they get 400,000 miles out of their engine, right? And I think that's a really reasonable expectation regardless of the engine. Yeah, the 3-liter might be able to last, in the grand scheme of things, a little bit longer for those reasons. But for the most part, focus on a good deal. Now, I will say this, if your budget's a little constrained and you're going for higher mileage, if you're a first-time buyer, I'd say stick with under 200,000 miles as a pretty hard limit. There's certain issues that occur around that time that if you get one before that, then you can kind of address those issues as they come up one by one, and it's not going to all hit you really hard at once. If you're going for a smaller engine, that the likelihood of finding an affordable used engine if yours ever breaks is very low, right? Just because of the total number of years they made that engine is a lot more constrained, and the number of vehicles they put that engine in is a lot more constrained. Go with an extra low miles on that one. Probably pre-100,000 is probably a pretty good rough number. And of course, these are all very rough, broad statements that don't encompass everything, but definitely focus on less miles if you're getting that smaller engine. And if it's a good deal, it's a good deal, Yeah.
Totally. Is there a difference between fuel economy between the two engines?
Oh, yeah. I don't know. Maybe I'm throwing these numbers out, maybe 20% on a good day. The real difference in fuel economy you'll see is from having a good running sprinter and a bad running sprinter, or a sprinter that's experiencing emissions issues and one that isn't. You'll see a lot more difference there. It can go as crazy as from 16, 17 miles per gallon up to 23, 24, and that's in a 3-liter. So yeah, those are real numbers.
And just to be clear, when you're saying that there may be on 2 equally well-running machines, maybe something like a 20% difference, is that in favor of the 2-liter or 3-liter? Which one are you saying is more efficient?
Yeah, the smaller one's going to be a little more efficient. Yeah.
Okay, so the next question is, and maybe this is more of a question that's relevant to building, and it seems like you've also had some dabbling in builds and choices made around building, and not just the vehicle, as a vehicle per se. The big question is, do people go for the 144 inch wheelbase or the 170 inch wheelbase? And I'm curious if you have thoughts on that, because it's definitely a question that I'm thinking about for myself.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love answering this question. And I'll throw a third option out there because not everyone still realizes that there's the 170 extended, right? That extra 1.5-ish feet in the back. I think it's 17, 18 inches, somewhere around there, right? That brings your total vehicle length to about 24 feet now. So let's put this in comparison. You have 19.5 feet for the smallest one, about 22 and a half feet for the regular long wheelbase. Then you have 24 feet. My two favorites are the absolute shortest and the absolute longest. I don't like the one in between because you get the worst of both worlds, right? You get the impracticality of the long wheelbase, right? Turning radius, just general day-to-day driving. It's a little bit more of a chore, but you don't get the convenience of that extra 1.5 feet. And that extra 1.5 feet is huge, right? I think it's about, I don't know, 60 or 70 cubic feet. Don't quote me on that. But you're going about five, almost 6 feet across by, a little over 6 feet high by 1.5, right? So 36 times 1.5, maybe 50 plus, right? Or 54, I guess. All right, whatever the number is, that's a meaningful difference in the amount of space, and that's a meaningful difference if you want to add like something like a interior shower or something, which generally I recommend don't have that one on the outside sticking out the back. So here's what I'll say. I have a 24 footer. It was one of my first sprinters. It's fully converted. I love it just because there's so much space. And if you're living out of it, if you're doing long trips, 1-2 weeks plus, or if you're more than one person, that's probably the one you want, just because you can pretty much fit everything within reason inside of it and go travel up to Alaska, down to South America. You'll be living well, especially if you're adding those extras like an AC unit, extra batteries, whatever. The space is amazing, right? If you're using it as a daily driver as well as a conversion, nothing beats the shorter one. It drives like an SUV, like with the exception of maybe a couple huge cities with really bad traffic and crazy roads. Like you'll be able to daily drive that one without any reasonable issues. It drives like a big SUV. There's SUVs longer than it. A Suburban XL or Yukon is like 21 plus feet, right? So it's not even that long. So yeah.
That's really helpful. I myself am leaning, if it's between the very smallest or the very largest, I'm definitely leaning on the smaller side. But I'm curious for people that are leaning on the wider side, if one is going to be driving around in a city, and you do have that vehicle, so how much of an inconvenience is that in like shopping mall parking lots and getting around in smaller corners?
Yeah, so I think you probably run into height restrictions more than length restrictions. A lot of times, if you have the tall one, you can't really go through many drive-throughs. And I don't really care what's posted on that drive-through sign because their franchise is required to have a certain height amount. So sometimes they'll just write, "Oh yeah, we're 11 feet tall," and the thing's like 7.5 feet. Like, I've seen that a few times. So if you get the tall one, the real issue is probably more the height than the length. But yeah, I mean, they're bigger vehicles, which are inconvenient to park. Definitely the shorter one. If parking's an issue in your neighborhood, if you don't have a driveway, yeah, probably the shorter one, I'd say is better for most people.
Yeah, perfect. Well, that leads right to the next question, which is a question of height, because there's a whole variety of heights that the roofs come in. I'm curious. I think I'm like averagely height. I'm like 5'10", which I think is something of a nice sweet middle spot. What are the various heights, and what might you recommend in terms of finding that sweet spot between having the headroom and also being able to drive through places and not getting stuck too often?
Yeah, let's talk about the base heights, like metal to metal. All right, the tallest one for the T1N in the US is about 6'2" on the inside, right? That sounds like a lot, but put a little bit of insulation and a roof on it, and then you have a little bit underneath for the floor, and you're getting a lot closer to 6 feet. So if you're anywhere near there and you're wearing shoes, you might need to slouch a little bit. That might not be a deal breaker for some people. It might be for others. I don't know. Pretty much the tallest roof Ford 2007 all the way up until now is 6'4" on the inside. So if you're thin on your insulation, you have a nice little bit of headroom for most people, and that's a really nice sweet spot. There is that weird mega roof, which is so rare. I think it's 6'11", I think, somewhere just under that 7-foot range. It's a fiberglass roof. I wouldn't go for it, just because a lot of times, since it's made of fiberglass, you're a little more prone to leaks, especially if it's an older 2007. I talked to someone who bought one of those mega roofs, right? And he said, oh yeah, there's so many leaks all the time. So that's a big issue. The only time I would suggest a low roof, like the real low roof, is if you're in a metropolitan area, you're parking in parking garages. There has to be like a real reason not to have that height that fits in your lifestyle, to get the lower one. The rear area will feel a lot bigger when you can stand up in it. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, for me particularly, I'm moving to the Sprinter to get that standing height, so
Mm-hmm.
I'll be looking for something. And you're saying that it's the 6.4, 6.5, which is like a recommended kind of sweet middle spot.
Yeah. Yeah,
Nice.
I think that works for most people. Like they just call it the high roof, right?
Yeah,
And anything that's long wheelbase comes in a high roof. There's no long wheelbase low roof option. So
Good to know. Good to know.
yeah.
If you see someone advertising it, no, that doesn't exist. Totally. It's almost like there isn't a systematized way that they could actually just be making use of. Tell me a little about the different drive options. So there's the rear wheel drive, the all wheel drive, the 4-wheel drive. What are your X on that?
Yeah. So again, 95% of Sprinter owners aren't really going to need anything more than a two-wheel drive, right? Everything that's not all-wheel drive or four-wheel drive for a Sprinter in the US is rear-wheel drive, which is nice. You have just the way the engine is configured, the way the transmission goes behind the engine towards the rear of the vehicle makes everything a whole lot easier to work on, right? You have a lot more space. When things are, if you take like the minivan setup, right, where they kind of call them side bangers because the transmission and the engine are all sort of on, it's really just cutting corners from a manufacturing perspective and making it really tough to work on for people later on because everything's so jam-packed in there. So yeah, you have a real nice setup, and that pretty much goes for all of them here in the US. Talking about the drivetrains, right? The newer all-wheel drive, they still offer a two-wheel drive, by the way. And that's fine for most people. Newer all-wheel drive, perfectly acceptable. Pretty much everyone, almost everyone, except for people who want to tow, are going to be more than happy with all-wheel drive. Towing goes down. Your towing capacity goes down if you do four-wheel drive or all-wheel drive. And very few use cases, if you're really trying to go really off-road or on the beach, all-wheel drive or four-wheel drive might be preferred. If you want to fit some really big tires, you have more. The four-wheel drive and all-wheel drive are lifted by about 3.5 or 4 inches. If you have the two-wheel drive version, you can get a 2-inch lift kit. They used to be very expensive. Now you can get them from Ukraine. I think they're about $1,000 or so. Most DIYers could install that within a weekend or so, and without hitting too many hiccups. Right? Pretty simple lift. That'll let you put on those bigger tires, give you that off-roady look. You still won't get the full clearance of the four-wheel drive with a lift of about 3.5 inches, but you're getting pretty close. So you can achieve that sort of off-roady look if that's what you're going for, with a two-wheel drive. And for the most part, it's going to be really tough finding a four-wheel drive Sprinter that's a good deal. Most of the time, you'll find the two-wheel drive. That's like 90+% of them. So, yeah.
Sweet. Just to also clarify, like the options that people are looking at, they're going to be diesel, they're going to be 7-speed automatic. That's standard throughout the range that we're talking about.
Yeah. So let's talk about the transmissions for a second. All right. So there's very, very few gas-powered Sprinters before 2019, you'll see a very rare, probably one in every 200 or 300, you might see a rare gas one that's usually off the road at this point because the gas engines only lasted maybe 200 to 250,000 miles before they went kaput, So we shouldn't even, it's so rare. We don't even need to discuss that option. For the 3-liter engine between 2007 to 2018, it was still the 5-speed automatic transmission. Even though the scan tool during the later years, it might think it's a 7-speed, still a 5-speed automatic transmission. Now, Mercedes, here's kind of an interesting, the 2.1 liters between 2014 and 16, I think those were the only years where they brought them out, went away, and then they brought them out again around 2019. Those were paired with the newer 7-speed transmission. Now, that 5-speed transmission has been around since I think 98 or so. Here's how kind of Mercedes does it, right? They roll out their new transmissions with their luxury models, and they sort of trickle down throughout the range over the years until they get to the cargo vans. And cargo vans are usually last to get them, all right? And just to give you an idea, this 5-speed transmission was so reliable, it was put in dozens of different American manufactured vehicles across Jeep, Dodge. A lot of manufacturers used it. The Wrangler used it up until like 2011. Super reliable, there's a lot of documentation out there on how to work on them. So, nothing wrong with that transmission. It's not the smoothest shifting. You only have 5 gears. But for the most part, like, just get that there's nothing wrong with it. It was in the vehicle for a while. Same thing goes for the 7-speed. Nothing wrong with it. A little tougher to work on if you're doing some repairs, but that's just getting into the nitty gritty of things. And I think now they're at the 9-speed for the Sprinter, which, it's just that trickle down effect. They start with their fancy luxury vehicles, and then slowly as that transmission develops and becomes more reliable, they put them in their cargo vans, right? So for the most part, just focus on getting the good deal and not on what transmission's there. But that might be a small reason as well to just stick with the 3.0 liter engine, just because it has a slightly more older mechanical transmission that's a little bit easier to work on. Yeah.
Totally. I know that we mentioned this at the top, but maybe this will come later in the edit. The different general body types. So cargo, passenger are the ones that most people see and know. I know you added without option. I was wondering if you might walk through some of those options, because those do make a considerable difference.
Yeah, let's see if I can roll this into the idea of why should someone, let's start this question this way. Why would someone get a used Amazon or FedEx van versus something else? And at the end of the day, if you're looking at the FedEx vans that are just ordered in bulk, they are the absolute bare bones vehicle, like really bare bones, like the lack of options. I've seen Sprinters that I don't think they even had an AC clutch, so the AC is just always on. Just as an example, the AC compressors are weird. There's like 6 different options, and you never know which one's which until you pull the part number or order by VIN. But small things like that, if you're getting a cargo van that's purchased in bulk, whether it's for Amazon delivery or FedEx, just know you're getting the absolute bare bones options. No windows, no fancy buttons, nothing. Does that mean you shouldn't get it? No, but just maybe be a little more aggressive in your bargaining. Be aware that it is an absolute bare bones option, and price it as such. Would I get, I have one van that's a bare bones option, and it was converted by a fancy conversion company, and it works great. So there's not necessarily anything wrong with that. I think I got off track and I kind of lost sight of your question.
No, that's a good question
Yeah.
as well, which is maybe a slightly separate question, which is looking at fleet vehicles like Amazon and FedEx.
Yeah.
But the original question is kind of choosing between something like cargo, passenger, or crew.
Yeah. So in general, you're going to see a lot more options on the passenger ones. But of course, it's like you said, you converted a passenger vehicle before. Your issue was having windows all around, way too many windows than you want, right? It makes building things tougher. It makes doing the walls tougher. There's definitely a trade-off there. That might be amazing for the average weekender who doesn't who's maybe just going to campgrounds every now and then and doesn't need that privacy or stealthiness. But for the most part, people are going to be happier getting a cargo van and then adding a few windows wherever they need to. It's not too tough to add windows, right? So that would be a huge preference in terms of if you had a choice and they were both equally priced, I would probably go for the cargo. Yeah.
You mentioned the crew as an option, as something in between the cargo and the passenger.
Yeah, there's kind of crew setups. You'll see a window or two cut out. You're probably going to see more options in those ones. Sometimes you'll see a bench seat as well because it's like crew, right? So we'll have like one bench seat behind the two front seats. Those are a little more rare. But yeah, that's definitely, and you can order these options individually. Not that anyone would buy new, but these options can be ordered individually from the factory. So calling something a crew as its own category may not be perfectly succinct because there could mean a number of things.
Totally.
But a lot of times you'll see those options in what they classify as crew.
Totally. You began to speak a bit earlier now about fleet vehicles, delivery vehicles, and that. Is there reason to get them, reason to avoid them? Or
Yeah,
besides what you said
so
earlier about that they're a base model?
yeah, so there's a number of things to consider, and there's actually a bit of disagreement about this from one person, from one, let's call it sprinter mechanic to the next. But there's a difference between someone might purchase a FedEx van or a group of FedEx vans, but I think it's FedEx Ground or something. It'll have a slightly different distinguishing title, right? Those are companies which are essentially buying the vehicles, but they're still their own vehicles that are branded as FedEx, right? The maintenance history on vehicles like that it's not standardized the way it might be from like if FedEx had its own fleet, which I believe it does. Those ones from the actually owned by FedEx versus owned by a company or an independent individual who purchases a van and maintains it in itself and is a FedEx driver, even though the vans will look the same. One might have a slightly different, we'll say they'll still have the same FedEx sticker with maybe something a little different underneath it. One might have far better service history than the other. So all that to say, really base it off of the service history and the individual you're purchasing from as opposed to what you're getting. Amazon's the same way. I don't think Amazon owns very few of their vans. It's generally owned by a third company that is able to purchase in bulk and then brand them as Amazon vans. All that to say, if the vehicle's low mileage, if you're getting something that's under 100K, they got to be pretty brutal with the service history to wreck it before 100K. So, yeah.
So I do hear a lot of people online saying like avoid fleet vehicles at all cost. The drivers abuse them. They're not worth touching. It seems that you're not in agreement with that popular consensus.
Yeah, there's definitely that aspect there. It's being driven like you don't own it. Yeah, sure. There's a lot to think about, right? If the driver's just some guy making, his $20 an hour, he probably doesn't care too much and he doesn't own the vehicle. He probably doesn't care too much about keeping it perfect, right? If the area that vehicle is in is super densely populated, right? You have a delivery route where you're stopping every 2 minutes and just driving in the city. those miles are going to mean a whole lot more than an extremely rural route where you're driving, 5 miles between addresses. So there's so much to consider. But with that said, that can be said for pretty much any company vehicle. If it's a fleet of plumbing vehicles or a fleet of HVACs, you're going to run into similar issues where the person driving it probably doesn't own it and doesn't have that pride of ownership that someone else might have. So there's definitely issues there with yeah.
Totally. I heard someone give a good bit of advice in purchasing vehicles in general. Like if you look at the way that the interior of the vehicle is being kept, it might say something about the way that the engine is being kept as well, right?
Yeah, there's this idea of pride of ownership. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you could argue that if you're a business owner, you care a lot about keeping the engine happy because that's your source of business. And if your employees are kind of trashing the interior, yeah, maybe. But yeah, absolutely. If you see pride of ownership throughout the vehicle, if it's maintained nicely, one thing to consider is where the windshield wipers sit. You can tell if something isn't cleaned or rust will develop there just because of a lot of foliage and it doesn't get washed too often. That's generally where a lot of dirt will accumulate and then you'll see rust. So even if someone does try and really spruce it up and give it the whole 9 yards in terms of detailing, you can't really hide that rust area. So little things like that suggest good pride of ownership. Absolutely. Yeah.
That's a good telltale sign. You mentioned earlier about things like wheels and the buttons on the steering wheel. I was wondering if you want to say anything more about sort of dash controls, interior kind of trim options that might make a vehicle more worth purchasing over another.
No, I mean you could argue that someone who was willing to purchase an optioned out vehicle might be more invested in taking care of it, so you might get a slightly better vehicle there for some reason. Right now, the two sprinters that I have that are driving nicely, one's complete base, one's optioned out with options I've never seen on a sprinter of that year. It's a 2008 and it has like lane assist and all this weird stuff that's kind of broken now, but it was the bee's knees back then, Xeon HID lights and all that jazz, which is a nice upgrade, by the way. If you notice that, if you get the higher end headlights, that's nice. Don't get me wrong. Ultimately, chase the deal and don't be like, oh, I'm getting this one because there's buttons on the dash. But it is nice to have, and it does make little things like upgraded seats, heated seats, and all that. Yeah, you can add it after, but it makes driving it a little nicer on long trips. Yeah.
Totally. I think that brings us into actually the buying part of this conversation, which is what kind of websites, online marketplaces are the best place to be looking for used sprinters?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, whatever. I would say just look everywhere, right? When I was looking for a sprinter, I was checking all across the US, Craigslist, Facebook Marketplace, wherever. If you're using Facebook Marketplace, set your perimeter to 500 miles and be willing to drive. I will say that great deals may not be next door. They might be a state or two away and be willing to go to make that drive. Stay away from buying vehicles in the Rust Belt, where it snows and the roads get treated with salt. That will generally lead to a lot more rust issues and a lot that can occur a lot faster. Be willing to go out of state. Texas used to have great deals. Now there's probably less of them. Areas where there's large metropolitan areas where the environment is kind on these older vehicles and there isn't as much of a hype about them as there is on the West Coast. There's a huge hype on the West Coast right now, right? Very tough to find a deal, whether you're in Southern California, Northern California, Oregon, Washington, etc. So be willing to go a couple states away. But if you're doing that, you better bring a scan tool and you better be willing to walk away from that, buy a return ticket if you're flying in from out of state to pick one up.
Are there any specific like car platforms, things like Auto Trader or Cars.com, any of those that you recommend or have had good experiences with?
So I think it comes back to the person you're buying it from as opposed to the platform you're buying it on. I will say this, buy from an individual over a dealership. I would say that talking to the previous owner, you're going to get a whole lot more information about how that vehicle was kept and how it was driven, what it was used for, as opposed to going to a dealership. Now, when it comes to financing options, most people don't realize you can finance these vehicles from a bank, from a credit union, and do a private purchase. I don't know anyone who's like, very few people realize you can do that. Very few people realize you can, go to your bank, say, hey, I want to do an auto loan. They'll give you a check written out to the owner of that vehicle. They won't sign it to you. They'll sign it to the owner, and they'll do their own due diligence. They'll confirm the vehicle's not stolen or whatever. They'll confirm, they'll do their own Carfax. They'll decide what it's worth. And then if they're not willing to give you everything it's worth, you can pay the difference in cash to the owner. You can get real creative with the financing options. And this probably doesn't pertain to you, but I know there's someone out there who needs to know that, because they're like, oh, I'll go to the dealership and I'll finance it I'll be locked in there. I'd say private party is the way to go for sure.
Dealerships also have a good way of getting people locked into financing plans that end up costing them a lot more than they would have spent on the vehicle.
Oh, yeah.
If they would.
Just the cost of yeah. Oh, just the cost of the insurance difference for a vehicle you don't own is incredibly higher, right? Because you have to have that comprehensive, what is the insurance term that people use that doesn't really mean anything? I think it's comprehensive coverage, or like you're protecting them against that 1% of the 1% chance of it being a total loss, right? Which is really expensive to protect against.
Totally.
Totally. Yeah. So
when someone shows up for a purchase, what are the kind of questions someone should be asking a seller? What kind of red flags should they be looking at, either with the seller, with the vehicle, service history? How does one approach a seller as a savvy purchaser?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. I am putting together like a pre-purchase inspection of things that are a little more unique that you can look for, which hopefully I'll have that out soon. But let's see, off the top of my head, definitely get some kind of scan tool that tells you when the last time the codes were reset. That'll tell you how long the vehicle has been running just fine, right? Because the owner might say, oh yeah, it's been running fine for years. I've never had an issue with it. And you look at it and it's, the codes were reset maybe 5 miles ago, maybe 500 miles ago. That tells you so much, right? Approaching it as a savvy purchaser, I'd say look at the smaller things, engine mounts. If you're in pre-2010, you can actually shine a light into the oil cap area and you can see how much the timing chain is worn out, how much the timing chain is stretched. That'll give you an idea of when that needs to be replaced, because that's an expensive replacement. Ask if it's 200,000 miles and the injectors have never been changed. Just say, okay, well, that's something I'm going to need to take care of probably within the next 50,000 miles or so. One thing I will definitely suggest, let them know before you're coming, say, hey, I want the engine to be ice cold. I don't want you to take it on a warm-up drive to get it up to operating temperature. The way the engine runs when you're starting it up from like a cold start, right? When it hasn't been run overnight, that'll be very different. One of the ways you can check for that is, just pop the hood, put your palm on one of the coolant lines and just see if it's warm. That's a great way. And there might not be insidious intentions around that. They might just think, oh, hey, I'll take it for a test drive, make sure it's running perfectly because I haven't driven it in a week and someone's coming to see it, right? So just let them know, hey, you want it cold when you get there, just because you want to turn it on, check if there's a little bit of smoke coming out the back during the first minute or two of idling. That can give you a lot of information on the general health of the engine. Yeah.
Something else which I've heard that worth looking at is people do what they call like the cap dance test. Is that something that you stand by?
Oh, sure. Yeah, that'll give you a really good idea of the blow by. Now, it is a little bit specific to the warmth of the engine, right? The issue on the newer ones, and I'll put a little diagram, I'll put something on the screen so that it makes sense, but you have a cap and then you have, well, essentially the area where you remove the cap, there's a little bit of a kind of like a snorkel going up. So you actually need to remove that snorkel. It twists off just like the cap. Then you put the cap on the actual engine. So you just kind of remove the in-between part. The cap will actually screw on. You actually don't need the snorkel. So do the cap dance on like the flat surface because the snorkel's kind of angled to the side. The cap won't really stay there. But yeah, that's great information for pretty much any car of any year. Give you an idea of the engine wear. Yeah.
You mentioned you mentioned looking for rust under the windscreen wipers. Are there any other sort of small indicators that are hard for an unsavory seller to hide or cover up that the purchaser can look for?
Get a scan tool, know the code, be very aware, don't hesitate to just like look up the actual codes on your phone or on Google. Get a scan tool that reads the actual manufacturer codes. That'll give you a lot more, much deeper idea of what's going on. And if you're a first-time purchaser, just be like, I actually need to look up what that code means. Don't be afraid to just be like a little cautious about it. You can always come back the next day or the same afternoon and get it if the codes are no big deal. Some codes that I will say that you could get a real great deal on is if you have kind of various low boost codes. If you watch I have 3 or 4 videos on those, and a lot of times they can be persistent issues that people will spend thousands of dollars and then give up. So if you're willing to put in a bit of work and you see some low boost codes, I wouldn't be scared of those. I would say, hey, that's a great deal. That check engine light's on. That thing's going to be a lot less expensive because I know I can fix it myself. But then it comes to that level of confidence, which I completely understand. If you're a first time buyer, that's going to be hard to have.
Totally. You mentioned that you'd done a video in the past on specific recommendations of scan tools. You said the video was a bit outdated. Is there anything you want to add or change to that video? Is there a new go-to recommendation that you would encourage people to look into?
Yeah. So the $50 scan tools might not be that amazing for the very new sprinters, maybe within the last 2019 plus. I haven't really vigorously tested them out on there. The sort of factory scan tool that I use, obviously that's pretty much what the dealership uses, so that's going to be the same. The one thing that I will say is the kind of $1,000 to $2,000 or $3,000 semi-professional / professional tools that you'll see at least most shops now, 4 years later, you're probably going to get something near that level for under $500. So that's really exciting, right? The software is becoming more and more mainstream. People saw the opportunity of offering high-level hobbyist tools from across the world, and they're capitalizing on that. So yeah, that's really exciting. So if you can afford it, get the $300 to $500 range. That should be beyond enough. And if you're getting it off Amazon or something, you can have a pretty good return policy. So if you decide not to buy a Sprinter, you can always send it back, and that's probably okay. Yeah,
that's a clever suggestion. Speaking of mechanical issues, what are the most common mechanical issues that show up in a Sprinter, both in terms of looking when buying and in terms of knowing what to be looking out for when riding?
Yeah, I'd say the biggest issue is probably when it's been worked on by someone who didn't know what they were doing. A shop, unfortunately, who didn't know what they were doing. So if you're seeing a persistent code, maybe it's been, there for a couple of years and you're seeing all kinds of stuff swapped out, that I'd say, be very aware of the service history. Not all shops necessarily know how to work on them. Some are great, some not so great. So, maybe check out the shops that have worked. If you see the maintenance history, it'll have the shop there. If that shop is still in business, maybe they were okay. Common issues are these are kind of, I'll call them temperamental engines. When they're working well, they work. When they're driving well, people love them. When they're not driving well, people hate them, so to speak, right? So it's kind of high effort, high reward because they do a lot. They're relatively quite small compared to American engines, and they're quite a bit more efficient compared to American engines. So it's a small engine that's trying to do a whole lot. And because of that, it has some extra sensors on it. So I'd say low boost is a big persistent issue that people maybe aren't fully aware of all the causes that contribute to it. And emissions issues is the main one, probably the biggest one. Yeah. Outside of that, these are pretty damn reliable engines. Even some of the things like coolant leaks and stuff, I've only had to maybe replace one radiator on the Sprinters in my entire time working on them. So, like the small things that maybe go bad on some cars might last forever on when it's built by Mercedes, which is actually encouraging. Yeah.
What are some of the symptoms of emissions issues?
Codes. I mean, the term limp mode, I'm not going to throw it out there because that's a commonly mischaracterized term. When your vehicle isn't revving above a certain RPM and it's generally just driving sluggish, a lot of times that can be emissions related. It can be triggered by other things, clogged up exhaust. In general, you'll see kind of one code it'll kind of be a full breakdown of, one issue leading to another issue leading to another issue. And that's the best I can do without really going into the nitty gritty where
Totally.
I feel like people will just, not get too interested, but watch some videos and on my channel, I guess.
Totally. I think that brings us to our final questions. One was that I noticed that there's a difference between Freightliner versus Mercedes-Benz Sprinters. Is that a difference that consumers or purchasers should be concerned about? What's the difference between those two?
No, yeah. So pre 2010, you would see Dodge, Freightliner, and Mercedes Sprinters just because there was some weird unifying agreement between the brands, I guess you could say. I think it was like a Daimler Chrysler Dodge merge or whatnot. Anything past 2010, you're going to see they're pretty much all Mercedes with the exception of a few Freightliners out there. Under the hood, they almost all look very, very identical, with a few exceptions of the placement of certain things. There's some really small differences. Maybe the part number for the AC compressor, maybe the location of the glow plug module is a tiny bit different. Maybe the fuel filter is a little bit different. There's some kind of unique parts that you really don't know what fits until you either give Mercedes your VIN or just look up the part number or take a very detailed picture of it and compare it to what you can see online. So yeah, you have some really small differences, but in terms of what you're buying, it's really more from a upgrades perspective, from an options perspective, and just to give you an idea of the real options that Mercedes has now. It's a little different now compared to maybe 10 years ago, but base Sprinter right now is at around low 50s, 53.5 or something like that. Guess how much the optioned out one is if you just select every single option in the book. Guess what we're talking about?
Maybe they could push it up to 65, 70.
No, guess again.
Don't tell me it's like closer to 100.
No, it's a little over 150.
Get out.
Yeah.
Get out.
Yeah. So that's
wow.
where, hey, options matter.
Sure.
At least from a bargaining perspective, just know what you're getting.
Totally.
Know if you're comparing apples to apples or apples to golden apples. I guess I don't know.
And those options include all the amenities under the sun, the electrical this and control
Yeah.
that, and
Yeah, even the wheelbase is considered an option. High roof is
mm,
considered an option. So there's options that matter. Don't get me wrong.
yeah,
Rear
yeah,
camera, things like that. Some don't.
totally, totally.
Yeah.
I think this might be the final question, and thank you so much for sharing your time and knowledge with me and with whoever else is joining to listen. Given all of the kind of optimal placement that we've been speaking about, so looking at something that's under 200,000 miles between the years of 2007 2009, 2500, the 3-liter engine, let's say the 144 wheelbase, 144-inch wheelbase, high roof, rear-wheel drive. What is a reasonable price that a purchaser should be looking to spend? I think that's really important to have a sense of like what's an appropriate ballpark figure so that they can be a wise buyer and know what their bargaining power is and what that space looks like.
Oh yeah, it's so tough to put a number on that, right? Because it depends on where you are, right? Now, with that said, if you're in like the California area, which a lot of aspiring Sprinter owners are, or on the West Coast, I've seen a lot of good deals kind of further into either Nevada or Arizona area where you don't have to go too far, but it's 10 hours away. It's not the worst drive in the world, right? So even if the Sprinter's not in perfect condition, you can probably still make it home. Somewhere between 5 and 20,000. It's so tough because every now and then you'll find an amazing deal. During the pandemic, I found an amazing deal. I got a Sprinter 24-foot optioned out. It was I got it for $4,670 and 110,000 miles. The thing ran perfectly. Had a few issues with it where it was the mechanics, they took it to misdiagnosed it, saying it needed this and that. It didn't. So I put like $300 into it and it ran beautifully. And it was definitely my best purchase. It wasn't my cheapest. Cheapest one I've gotten was under 3K. And that wasn't a good deal, believe it or not. So know what you're getting. Know, yes, mileage matters. The way it was driven probably matters more. If it's an ambulance or if it's used for like city driving or if it's used where it's idling a lot, you can kind of throw those mileage numbers out the window because if you really care about the amount of time that vehicle's on, especially if it's idling, there's a lot more happening to it. And kind of a lot more stuff is blowing past the pistons when they're cold. The fuel's getting diluted with diesel, which makes it less lubricant. There's reasons why ambulance vans don't really last too much more than 300,000 miles. That's generally because they're idled all day and all night because, you have EMT sitting in them at different areas for different events, etc. Yeah, so just really be aware of the way it's used and don't just go off the mileage. Let me ask you this. When you do get your van, where are you going to take it? What's that look like?
Yeah, so right now the plan is to stay on the West Coast. I've really been enjoying this part of the country. I started off East Coast and I drove out west. And my basic thoughts are like just to this is like the extent of my plans, is like be in nature as much as possible and head up like North Coast during the summer and down coast during the winter. That's about as much as plans. I spent a bunch of time in the East Sierra Nevada, like mountain range up towards Yosemite, Sacramento. Really enjoyed that region. Came down through Berkeley on the coast, spent some time there, house sitting and whatnot. But basically just enjoying enjoying the good nature and weather along the western coast is like the vision going forward.
Yeah, how far north do you think you'll go? You think in Alaska or like Washington?
I'm thinking more Washington than
Okay,
Alaska,
yeah.
yeah.
Let's see. My wife and I did that trip. We stayed along the coast on the one all the way up to Seattle over the Christmas break. It was right. I think they shut down portions of Highway 1 now. They were saying they were going to shut down we were seeing signs as we were going. We're like, well, at least we're making the trip now. But great way to really experience the coast. Don't expect to drive far because I think we spent a week plus getting there and 2.5 days coming back, on the freeway. So yeah, it's definitely a journey, a trip, but it's really fun as well. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I did the drive from New York to California,
Yeah.
and I really enjoyed that. Went through Colorado, spent time with
Hmm.
friends. Yeah, for me, I'm not really rushed about it. My work is all remote and digital, and I mean,
Hmm.
besides for like, I'm now teaching here over the summer in like Simi Valley near LA.
Oh yeah.
But otherwise, I'm pretty remote and mobile, so it's all the same to me.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. I haven't really figured out a way to cross the country in a way that's enjoyable because
Right.
a lot of the routes they take you, it's trucking routes. You're at truck stops and freeways, and
Totally.
everything's just sort of designed for people to drive through it and keep going along their way. I'm gonna have to pick your brain about that sometime, how to
Yeah. Yeah,
drive
totally.
across the country in a way that's
I
enjoyable.
will I will say that I did it. I mean, a lot of it was truck stops and pass-throughs, and I also did it for pragmatic reasons. I was living in New York. I bought
Hmm.
the van in New York. I converted it at a friend's workshop over the course of a month in New York, and then I had like a gig to be here in California, and the intention was to drive to California to be here for the beginning of last July. So I'm not going to pretend like it was, I also did it like just over the course of like 2 or 3 weeks. So it wasn't like a proper cross country road trip. But I mean, it was still very beautiful and very enjoyable. And I'm happy to chat about what that experience was like for me. Totally.
That would be cool. Yeah, maybe we should
Yeah.
see about doing a follow-up for this and talk about that. I do want to catch people like yourself who have had that experience and really shed a realistic perspective on it. You said
Totally. Totally.
there was at least a component of necessity at the time in terms
Yeah.
of, what caused you to build it. And, there were certain deadlines it sounded like to get yourself
Yeah. Absolutely.
across the country.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be very cool.
Yeah. 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 Happy to talk about like the realities of it, practically what it takes to convert oneself. Like I did it on a budget, which was, I think, a lot less than what people think that it costs. Yeah, and what's that like, both in terms of like the pleasures along the way and the pains along the way. Definitely happy to share.
Yeah, there's definitely both, right? So,
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. Absolutely.
You originally bought a Ford Econoline around 2013. You converted it, you traveled around, loved it. What were some of the limitations to that vehicle specifically?
Yeah, I would say the main limitation was the headroom in the back. And needing to either be sitting, lying down, or crouched over. Those were the three options. Um, so that was the primary limitation for sure.
Yeah, so that gets old pretty fast, is what you're telling me.
It gets old really, really fast.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Have
Very
you,
much so.
yeah, did you ever try cooking or anything in it? What's that like? Is that,
So yeah, the design that I went with was like the kitchen was outside. It was like a
Mhm.
portable stove setup. And I had kind of pull outs or like sort of drop down shelves. So I never tried cooking inside the vehicle.
Mhm.
I did sometimes cook kind of inside, like on like the little front foyer area that I had built out. But mainly it was cooking outside. So either entirely outside away from the van or on like a drop down shelf. But I can imagine that trying to cook inside in any other way would be challenging.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of people try cooking setup, and I'm always curious like how practical it is, how often it gets used. If someone wants to cook on a daily basis, is that something they'll use on a daily basis? You kind of, in my experience, unless you're the casual weekender, in my experience, a lot of times you're trying to not draw attention to yourself when you're in a van around a
Sure,
major metropolitan area.
sure.
Did you find you used that as, let's say, as often as you liked, or no?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that also comes down to like where one ends up being mostly in the van, whether it's in the city or like out in nature. And I tried as much as I could to not be in urban areas. I was trying to be in nature as much as possible. Um, and I would do that like a few weeks at a time. So I cooked a whole lot with it and I used it every day, multiple times a day. Um, when in nature, that's obviously no problem. But you're totally right to point out that like living if you're in a city for a few nights or longer, then that becomes problematic. I would like find I would like even if I was in a city, I would like be near a park or something with like a bit of greenery, and then I could kind of cook in the park and kind of like picnic it a little. But I could see that also being difficult if someone was like more urban van, I think for sure.
Sounds like you're ready to do it again. Uh, a lot of times people's first conversions aren't their best. They kind of make a lot of different design choices. What kind of design choices do you think you'll implement in this one? Are you
Totally, totally. Yeah. I'm actually like really looking forward to taking what I've learned from the first one. I think the one big mistake that I made with the first van is that I opted when I was doing the vehicle purchase to specifically look for a passenger van, which has
Mhm.
like windows all around, and realizing now that I didn't really use like all of the with the windows much, and it just created it made the build and design process much more difficult because you have to be like contending with all of this empty space as opposed to
Mhm.
just using that wall space. It was much less storage. Window glass is not great as an insulator, so installation
Mhm.
challenges. And I had these like insulated pull out blackout fills, but I never even I rarely took them out, even though I was in nature most of the time. So I think like one thing which I definitely learned from doing that was that I don't want to go for a passenger option. I'm looking for a cargo option.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I would put that out to people in general that are thinking about like what base model van they're looking to go with, because there's always almost an option between cargo and passenger. Um, and I would say for me, I would definitely go cargo going forward.
Yeah, yeah, and there is sort of the quote crew option for the Sprinter, which is generally kind of a nice combination. Sometimes we'll have usually not more than one side window on the door and maybe the two rear windows, which I've found to be not a problem at all. Having, at least one side window is generally nice. Two side windows, not a bad idea either. Rear windows, up to the individual. If you got the van without them, you're probably not gonna waste time cutting them in. But if you have them, why not? It's not a bad compromise. Yeah. Yeah, they had it at some point. You could like when you were doing the ordering online, you could specify a crew. I checked out the website. I don't remember if that specific option is there, but they've kind of modified their options a little bit. So, there are factory window options, and a lot of times you'll find them on the used market as well.
Hmm.
Now, I will say the one downside a lot of times the passenger ones, they generally get optioned out more than the cargo ones for some reason. So you do end up with some nicer, fancier options on the one, which
Hmm.
not really a deal breaker, but sometimes, especially if you're going for that pre-2019 range, the sort of 2007 to 2018 before the whole design refresh, having some of those upgrades can be really nice. Yeah.
Hmm. Hmm. That's good to know. And those upgrades are usually more in the like passenger options you're saying.
Yeah, a lot of stuff around the driver's seat. Like there's an
Great.
upgraded dash option, which kind of gives you more access to sort of resetting drive cycles and whatnot. You get a steering wheel with buttons on it, which is usually a good sign. If you have a steering wheel with buttons on a Sprinter between 2007 to 2018, you're probably going to have a lot of options with that. Now, with that said, if you, from the inside of a Sprinter, most people, including myself, you wouldn't be able to tell if you're driving a 2007 versus a 2018. There's that little change between the model years. On the outside, you have the refresh in 2014, which, if you have an optioned out 2007 versus a base 2018, you're not really going to be able to tell the difference from the inside. Yeah.
Wow, fascinating. Yeah, I had no idea. I did notice that when you were looking at some models, you were like noticing things around the dash and the wheel, and I was curious what it was that you were seeing. So that's helpful to know.